morning. Welcome to the ASFPM virtual conference. We are here on the mapping track, and today I welcome you to the State Mapping Initiative. We will begin with Ms. Jacquelyn Hayes from the Texas Water Development Board. She's a flood outreach specialist, and she will be speaking on developing base level engineering for Texas watersheds, a cooperating technical partners initiative.
Hello, my name is Jacquelyn Hayes, and I am a GIS specialist on the flood mapping team at the Texas Water Development Board. And I'm here today to talk to you about developing base level engineering for Texas watersheds, which is an ongoing cooperating technical partners initiative, as well as a state initiative. So before I dive into any specifics about Texas, I just wanted to give you a brief overview and some context about the current base level engineering coverage that we do have throughout FEMA Region 6. And so base level engineering is a product that is specific to FEMA Region 6. And this web viewer was actually launched in the spring of 2018 as a partnership through USGS and FEMA Region 6. And actually, it's a product of the Interagency Flood Risk Management Team, which includes FEMA, USGS, the National Weather Service, and the Army Corps of Engineers. So, yeah, this is their website. It's called the Estimated Base Flood Elevation Viewer. And this essentially is where anyone with an internet connection can go online and view these base level engineering results. And so, of course, throughout the presentation, I'll go into a little more detail about the products and exactly what you can get from this website. However, I just wanted to give you kind of a broad overview and some context about our current base level engineering coverage throughout FEMA Region 6. And so if you look at Texas, you can see that we definitely do have some base level engineering coverage, but we are aiming to substantially increase that coverage through both the Texas Water Development Board and through the CTP partnership that we have with FEMA Region 6. Okay, now I'm going to dive into talking about Texas. And I just kind of want to frame our current flood mapping status for you. Texas has 254 counties, and nearly half of those have no maps or are only partially mapped with paper maps. So half our state, half the counties in the state have either no information or information that's rather difficult to use. And then the remaining half of the counties do have those digital flood insurance rate maps, or DFIRMs. However, a number of these were created under the FEMA map modernization era. And so if you're not familiar with that, it was from 2003 to 2008, and it improved the nation's flood maps and provided 92% of the nation's population with these digital flood insurance rate maps, which was a needed change. Again, those paper maps are kind of hard to access for the public and also difficult to use. However, when transitioning to this digital format, several of the paper maps, they just redelineated the existing floodplain. So you have to keep in mind that even though a county may have a digital flood insurance rate map, it doesn't necessarily mean that a new study was done or that there's more updated flood hazard information than there was previously on those paper maps. So just something to keep in mind when you're looking at these statistics. And then of those DFIRMs, of the counties that do have those digital flood insurance rate maps, 40% are at least 10 years old or older. And then another 40% are from 5 to 9 years old. And then only 20% of those DFIRMs in those counties have been updated in the past 5 years. So you can see that we're looking at a lack of information and also old and outdated information. And so kind of to put this in context as far as communities who are relying on this data, Texas has 1,257 communities that participate in the National Flood Insurance Program. So if you're familiar with this program, you know that these communities are trying to regulate development within their floodplain by using the data on these effective firms. And so it's really difficult to regulate development in your floodplain if you don't know exactly where it is. And so that's what 12% of these communities are dealing with. They have no floodplain maps or floodplain maps that aren't complete. And then 23% of these participating communities have either no maps or partial paper maps. So again, either incomplete data or data that's not as accessible and harder to use. And so on top of all of this, we also have to remember that the Texas landscape is changing. So it's really important to have that current and updated flood hazard information due to multiple factors. So we have increasing urban development. According to a Texas land trend study, which used information from a 2017 US Census Bureau study, the Texas population has increased 48% from 1997 to 2017. And then based on another study by the Texas Demographic Center, which looked at Texas urban and rural population shares, in 1910, 24.1% of Texas population resided in urban areas. And then by 2010, this had risen to 84.7. So as this information shows, we're getting more people, they're moving to the more metropolitan areas. With that comes more development, so more impervious surfaces, more homes in the floodplain, more fill in the floodplain. And so say you have a map that's only 5 years old, you say, well, that doesn't sound so bad. But if you keep in mind this rapidly changing environment due to population change and moving into these urban areas, the characteristics of the floodplains in those areas is going to change pretty rapidly with the development. And so maybe that information that was pretty decent 5 years ago is just no longer valid in light of these changes. And so we also have to look at things like historical, spatial, and temporal rainfall data. And so we now have Atlas 14 available to us, which those previous studies clearly did not. And so Atlas 14 definitely showed some areas in Texas seeing increased rainfall amounts. And so these rainfall amounts are used to model the floodplain. And so moving forward, it's definitely important to consider this more current updated information and how that affects the floodplain extents. And then, of course, things like relative sea level change, which can pose an increased risk of flooding for our coastal communities. And last but not least, we have more access to LiDAR. And so I'll touch on that a little bit more here in a second. But, you know, this LiDAR is just this high resolution ground elevation data, whereas before those previous maps were based off of USGS topographic quadrangles. That's where they got the topographic information to model the floodplains. And so now that we have access to this LiDAR data, it can give us a more detailed picture of what's going on the ground surface. And so that's really, so this is what is base level engineering. These are the three main components of what makes up this base level engineering data. We have LiDAR, that high resolution ground elevation data, plus hydrology and hydraulic inputs. And so for the hydrology and hydraulics, these are very foundation level, more automated engineering models. And so we won't get into the details on those, but just know that they're base level, they're not detailed studies, and they're highly automated. So you have this LiDAR, this hydrology, and this hydraulic engineering, and you get base level engineering. And so we'll unpack it a little more here in a second, but I just wanted to touch briefly back on Texas LiDAR coverage. So you saw that LiDAR was one of the building blocks of this base level engineering data. And so without LiDAR coverage, we would not be able to develop this base level engineering. And so this is the current status of the LiDAR coverage in Texas. You can find this information on the Texas Natural Resources Information System, or TNRIS. I've linked their website right there. They're a division of the Texas Water Development Board, and they're the State Geographic Information Office. And as you can see from this map, we are very close to having full LiDAR coverage, and we should have it by 2021. So the areas in green are currently available and ready for download, and the areas in yellow are still in production and pending release. And so we have to give a big thank you to FEMA Region 6. They poured a lot of money and invested in this LiDAR acquisition. And so again, to reiterate, without this LiDAR, we would not be able to have base level engineering statewide. Okay, so back to the space level engineering. To recap, you put this LiDAR input along with the foundation level hydraulic and hydrologic models, and it gives you this credible engineering analysis and modeling for local communities and developers. And so one thing about base level engineering and the products, which we'll touch on more here in a second, but they are actually model backed. So everything is model backed, and with the products that you can download from that estimated base flood elevation viewer that I showed you earlier, you can download the models that were used to create this data. And so local communities and developers can use them to tailor it to the projects that they need. So if you have local information that you can add on to the models that exist, you're more than welcome to do that, and it can really help you tailor your product to your community or to your needs. And so those products include, with the base level engineering, they include your flood extents, your water surface elevations, and your flood depths. So you get all of that information with a base level engineering product. And then this information can be adopted as best available information by communities to help inform development decisions. And so a little more on the results. These models create flood hazard information that does meet FEMA's standards for flood risk projects. So this is a FEMA approved product. Oh my goodness, sorry. And then these results agree with a Zone A mapping designation. So essentially what that means with those foundation hydraulic and hydrologic models, it creates a baseline model, hence the name base level engineering, to create an sort of an equivalent to an approximate A zone on a firm map. However, let's remember this, it's an approximate study. So BLE is not a detailed study. Base level engineering is not meant to replace your firm, even if it does have more updated information. The firm maps have gone through a more detailed study process, and they've gone through due process as far as regulatory requirements. And so base level engineering does not replace your firm. It's meant to be more of a supplement in areas where there was no information previously, or where the information was really not really outdated and not reflecting the current flood risk in that area. And so also, something to note about these results, they cover an entire watershed. So we are currently developing base level engineering at a HUC 8 scale. And so HUC just stands for Hydrological Unit Code, and it's a USGS unit of measurement for these watershed sizes. So we're currently developing at a HUC 8 level, and for that entire watershed, again, you get your floodplain boundaries, your water surface elevation grids, and your flood depth grids. And so really quickly, again, these results are meant to be scalable. You can do them at any size, but we'll talk about it a little bit more later. Really having it at this large watershed scale can help on cost efficiency and modeling efficiencies. And so that's one benefit. But I did want to say that the data resulting from this analysis can be updated as needed and used for your eventual production of your firm or a regulatory product. So essentially, this is the starting point. This is the minimum investment. And again, they're scalable, or these results are scalable, so you can make them as detailed as you need to be and possibly take it up to a regulatory firm. It just depends on what you need to do in your community. And so kind of the intent of the region is to build an inventory of watershed models that covers the entire region 6 geography. So for this reason, all flood projects in the region will originate with a base level engineering investment. Again, this is the starting point, the minimum investment, the base level of the modeling that you'll need to do in order to possibly go on to a regulatory firm update. Okay, so let's talk about some benefits of base level engineering. We have that, again, it's at that large watershed scale, and so you get a comprehensive picture of flood risk for the entire watershed. It covers that entire watershed rather than a more detailed study that focuses on specific stream mileage. And it also provides modeling to support local flood mitigation strategies. So like I was talking about earlier, all of these results are model backed. And so you can take those models and tailor them to your specific flood mitigation strategies, projects, and initiatives. It also, a benefit is that it provides information to support local planning and development decisions for multiple community departments. So say you're looking at your firm and you see that this area that somebody wants to put a subdivision is not in a floodplain according to the firm. But you look at your base level engineering data and it says, oh, this area is in a floodplain. You can use this base level engineering data as a supplement to your firm data to say, okay, well, even though it's not in a flood zone on the affected firm, maybe we can put some higher standards in this area because we see that there is some, that this area is flood prone based on the base level engineering data. And so let's put some elevation requirements there, or let's not put a subdivision there. Let's reserve this space as a green space or a community park because we can see that it's prone to flooding according to this information. And so you can use it kind of in that context. And then another benefit is that it is less time intensive than a detailed study or a firm update. So firms can take anywhere from 12 to 24 months for just modeling and then map production. And then you've got another 12 to 24 months to include the due process, like the notification letter, the letter of final determination, the appeal process. So you're looking at around 4 years for a regulatory firm update, whereas base level engineering only takes 9 to 12 months to produce and to get on that base level engineering viewer that I showed you earlier. And so, excuse me. Another benefit is that there is increased stakeholder involvement. And so during the BLE production process, stakeholders are able to meet with the engineers and go over the results and offer input and suggestions throughout the process. So again, no one knows the flooding in the community and the history of flooding better than the people who live there and the people who have lived there for years. And so that is definitely one benefit of the base level engineering. It's really useful to have that input both for the engineers and the community so that by the time this product gets on the viewer and can be adopted as best available information, everybody's happy with kind of the result. Okay, and so because of those benefits, that is why we are aiming for statewide BLE coverage. And so again, to meet our goal, we want to get that updated flood hazard data to Texas communities rather quickly. Again, touched on it, but the base level engineering development only takes about 9 to 12 months, again, from modeling it to getting it on the viewer. So it's a lot faster than the 4 years it would take to get a regulatory firm update. It's cost effective, talked about this a little bit earlier, but those larger scale studies can build on modeling efficiencies. So rather than doing a detailed stream mileage study, it kind of gives this large, more automated modeling for a large area, which can be cost effective. And then last but not least, of course, base level engineering can support our regional flood planning groups. And so since 1997, our agency has facilitated locally driven regional water supply planning to ensure communities have the water that they need in time of a drought. But just recently, our legislature directed us to carry out locally driven flood planning modeled after that process. And so we just got this going. That process is underway now. And we are trying to create, or we are tasked to create a state flood plan. And so we've kind of divided the state into some regions into these regional flood planning groups to get regional plans to eventually create that state plan. And so we're hoping to provide the baseline data, which is created by this BLE process, for use by these regional flood planning groups, as well as just the general public as well. Okay, and so that brings us to our current coverage in Texas. So these are our current base level engineering phases. Out of the 208 HUC 8s that we have in Texas, about 50 are complete or are in progress. And these have been completed by either FEMA Region 6 or through our Cooperating Technical Partners program with FEMA Region 6. And so those are the areas in that pink and that purple there. And if you'll look at that phase, so you'll see the BLE phases, we have 1, 2, and 3. The one that is crosshatched with TWDB down on the coast, we actually just kicked that off, and we're hoping to have that done by October or November. And that's really exciting because we actually received state funding specifically for those mapping efforts through the most recent legislature, again, in support of that state flood plan. And so those in the hashed area down on phase 1 are TWDB funded. The areas in the crosshatched areas, excuse me, in blue are the ones being completed by FEMA, FEMA Region 6. And then the ones in white, we are about to kick those off very soon. And those are actually being done through our CTP program. So FEMA provided the TWDB with funds through our CTP partnership to complete those watersheds that are hashed in white. And so moving forward, we're still working on how exactly we're going to break up that green phase 2. I'll give you a little more background here in a second, but we are hoping to kick off more of that phase 2 here in the summer. And then I will tell you why we have to wait for that, that West Texas area for phase 3. But by October, November, we are planning to have 1/3 of the state covered. So we're moving pretty fast and furious. And we're aiming to have that complete statewide base level engineering coverage by 2024. And so again, kind of how we're prioritizing this is using those regional flood planning boundaries that are loosely based off of river basins that we kind of talked about. The board designated these regions on April 9th of this year. So we're, again, just hot off the press. This is new. And so to kind of work with those modeling efficiencies that we talked about, we're going to try and fill in these regions the best that we can. And also just so we don't have a checkerboard effect with this information across the state. Unfortunately, if you'll remember this LiDAR acquisition, this West Texas area does not have the LiDAR currently available yet. It's still in production. Again, hopefully we should have this by 2021, but until we do, we're gonna have to wait a little bit longer on that West Texas area. So we're keeping that at phase 3. But still, we are aiming to have that statewide coverage for base level engineering by 2024. And I know I touched on this at the beginning, but just to reiterate, this is the estimated base flood elevation viewer. This is where you go. This is where you can find all of those areas in pink and purple that we just looked at that are either current or in process. And so they're either on the viewer or they will be on the viewer very soon. And you're going to kind of have some options when you first go to the estimated base flood elevation viewer. You can click view base level engineering data, and so that'll take you to the screen that I showed you at the very beginning, and you can just kind of zoom into the area that you'd like to look at. Or you can go to download data sets and models. And so from there, you can actually click on the watershed that you're interested in downloading the data sets and models for, and it'll download the entire data set for that HUC 8. And then you can also do a property lookup. So a specific property, you can put in your address and pull up a specific site report for that property. And so please go check it out. Here's kind of what it looks like. Again, here it has toggled on for this layer, it's the flood depth, but you can change that depending on what you want to look like. So right now it's showing flood depths, but if you click on data layers, you can look at your flood extents or your water surface elevations, whatever you're interested in checking out. So please go tool around and see kind of what current information that we have available there now. And then as far as future implications, we are so excited about this statewide base level engineering. We're thinking that it will equip Texas communities with an important tool which is necessary to make better informed decisions regarding the floodplain management. And this efficient large-scale base level engineering development is a viable option to many watersheds and communities nationwide. So we hope by sharing this information today that we can kind of share how we're tackling the lack of updated flood hazard data in Texas, and also highlight the benefits of this base level engineering development so that other states are made aware and that they can benefit from this information. And so that is all I have for you today. I really appreciate this opportunity. If you have any questions, I will be available, but also my manager, Manuel Razo, he'll be on the call with me. And so if you have any questions for either of us, we will be available. Also, shout out to Manny. He helped me a lot with this presentation, so I appreciate that. But thank you so much for your time and look forward to hearing from you. All right, thanks.
Good morning. That was a very interesting discussion. I've learned a lot about Texas BLE effort, and I hope you did too. We're going to address some of the questions that were offered in the Q&A section. The first one came from Rhonda. Her question was, can the BLE data be used as best available data when there is no mapping available?
And the answer is yes. So this kind of covers some of the other questions that were answered as well, or were asked as well. But the base level engineering data, it's an approximate study. It's not supposed to replace your firm. It's a supplement to it. And so it's not something that technically is adopted, but you can choose to adopt it in your and incorporate it into your flood damage prevention ordinance or court order. And so definitely in areas where there are no further studies or detailed studies and there are no maps available, you can use this base level engineering data as best available data, but it's definitely up to you and your community to decide whether to incorporate that into your ordinance or not. And just to reiterate, if you had a study where it is an AE zone, you can't use that base level engineering data as best available information there. Again, only where it's not available, there's no data at all, or it's an approximate A zone, you can still use it in those areas.
Thank you. Jacquelyn, we also had some questions about how did you prioritize rural communities versus more urban communities? What is your decision process for deciding which communities, which watersheds are involved?
Yeah, so for a lot of our rural communities in Texas, there's just no information at all or very outdated information, as opposed to some of the more rural communities that maybe have some CTP partners or, like Harris County Flood Control District. They might have more champions that help with flood hazard data in that area. So we really wanted to get to those rural communities to just give them some more information or more updated information. If that kind of answers your question.
Yeah. Now, on the flip side, there was a question about the Dallas-Fort Worth area. It was indicated that the BLE's data was conducted or compiled for that area, but how do they access that and how do they get to that?
Okay, so if it is up, you should go to that base flood elevation viewer that I linked on the on the presentation. You should be able to go there. If it's not there, that means it's still in process or it's still getting validated. And so I can get you that information when it can be, but I'd have to ask someone at FEMA Region 6, who they're the ones who kind of get it up onto the viewer.
And does this BLE data include the LiDAR data?
No, I don't believe the LiDAR data is included. You would have to get the LiDAR information off of the TENRIS website that I referenced also in the presentation.
Okay. So here's a question.
Okay.
If we're using BLE data, can we use that to modify, to guide development in flood-prone areas without it being considered a taking?
Yes. So because the National Flood Insurance Program, the intent is to protect properties and people from flood damage, it wouldn't be considered a taking. Also, as we, sorry, we need to wrap it up soon, but as we discussed before, this is not a regulatory product. And so when it is the community's choice to kind of adopt these regulations or to use them. And so if the property owners don't want to, Whitney was talking to me about this, you can actually have them sign a form that says, well, I acknowledge that this is an area that is flood prone according to this data, and sign it off and say, okay, we're just not going to use this data. So it's not necessary or regulatory, but you can adopt it to be that way.
Well, thank you so much. Unfortunately, we've reached the end of the Q&A session for this particular presentation, and we're going to move on to the second portion of this presentation. We're going to talk with Thuy Patton, who is the Flood Mapping Program Manager for the Colorado Water Conservation Board. We'll also be joined by Christopher ID, who's a senior engineer with Wood, and they will be discussing Colorado from paper maps to risk map and beyond. Thank you.
Hi, and thank you for attending this presentation of the ASFPM 2020 conference. We'll be talking about Colorado's flood mapping program from paper maps to risk map and beyond. I'm Thuy Patton, Floodplain Mapping Program Manager at the Colorado Water Conservation Board, or otherwise known as CWCB. Our agency has been a cooperating technical partner with FEMA since 2002.
And I'm Chris Ide, a project manager for Wood Environment and Infrastructure and one of the mapping contractors working with CWCB.
I will give a brief overview and history of the mapping program in Colorado over the years and turn it over to Chris to talk about our current program and the advancements we have made just in the last few years. Colorado participated in FEMA's map modernization program, which started in the early 2000s and was set to end after 5 years with the goal results of all of FEMA's paper flood insurance rate maps converted to a digital format. This map shows the status for Colorado's progress towards updating paper maps in Colorado through 2005. And as you can see, only about a third of the counties were either completed or in progress. There are many factors that impacted the ability to update flood maps in Colorado at the time, mainly due to the inaccurate mapping on effective paper maps, which were 25 to 30 years old, and the lack of funding available for updating flood studies, as well as the limited amount of high-quality topo data available in our state. These two tables show the funding distribution for the program from 2004 to 2008. Colorado is in Region 8, which received a lower amount of funding than many of the other regions during that time. The funding overall for the program nationwide was limited, and the goals of the program were to convert the paper flood maps to a seamless countywide digital flood map, not necessarily to conduct new analyses or provide updated flood studies. This map reflects that funding distribution and progress of the map modernization program by the end of 2009 nationally. As you can see, many of the eastern states had better success with the program than anywhere in the U.S., especially in the Midwest and Western states, including Colorado. Colorado had a number of challenges with the MapMod program, which included outdated and inaccurate mapping depicted on the paper maps, and with the lack of funding and topography available, updated flood studies were completed on very few reaches, and many of the remaining areas were converted floodplains from the paper maps or redelineations of what was on the paper maps. The main focus during this time was completing the technical work and not necessarily focused on communication and outreach. Dealing with local officials was definitely a challenge, especially when the program fell short on meeting local expectations for updated flood studies, again due to the lack of funding, but we still had to move forward with a final map and product that communities could support and manage. Lastly, it was towards the end of the MapMod years that levees and non-levee embankments started to emerge and impact mapping projects here in Colorado. As we transitioned out of the MapMod program and into RiskMap, we learned to start engaging and working with communities better, viewing it more like a partnership and obtaining more local input and support. With funding now available for topo acquisitions and updating studies, we were able to produce more accurate mapping products and at a larger watershed-wide scale, and the focus started to expand to other hazards as well, not just flood risks. 2013 was the turning point for Colorado's RiskMap program. In September of 2013, the state was hit with a historic flood event that literally changed the landscape, making updating flood maps a top priority. State Senate Bill 15-245 was passed that provided state funding to create the Colorado Hazard Mapping Program and remap communities most impacted by the 2013 flood. There was also funding to look at erosion hazards, debris flow, and update flood risk in areas still utilizing paper flood maps that were 30 to 40 years old. Awareness of flood risk and interest increased tremendously post-2013, not just in the post-flood areas, but across the state. We elevated our outreach efforts and strategies and updated our messaging to help people better understand their flood risks and how the post-flood data was incorporated into our RiskMap projects. CHAMP also included other hazards as well, including debris flow and erosion hazards. The CWCB has a robust erosion hazard mapping program and has conducted pilot projects across the state. This map shows the flood-impacted communities and reaches that were updated as part of the state-funded program for Phase 1 and 2. Over 700 miles were updated, and the work completed through CHAMP are now moving forward as FEMA RiskMap projects. Phase 3 of CHAMP focused on counties still utilizing paper maps, as shown here. There were about 24 counties in Colorado still utilizing paper maps. That's about 1/3 of the state. The counties highlighted in the blue hash did not have updated topography, and therefore we were only able to provide a digital conversion, and the remaining counties shown had limited topography. But we were able to update reaches that were highest priority for those communities shown. We have acquired additional LiDAR in the state, and the status of some of these counties have changed, which Chris will provide some more detail and progress that Colorado has made in just the last few years.
We're now going to discuss the current RiskMap activities that are going on within Colorado. As we get started, let's take a look at the current effective mapping dates for all the counties in Colorado. Now, just to note, this is a snapshot of what it looks like today. There are a number of active and ongoing projects, and some of which are preliminary, and some of these dates are going to be changing here real soon. But as can be seen from this figure, some of the maps haven't been updated since 1974, and a number of the counties are still using old flood hazard boundary maps and community-based maps. This means that there weren't any detailed hydrologic or hydraulic studies that were performed in these areas, and none of these miles would be considered valid within the Coordinated Needs Management Strategy or CNMS database. And all of the counties need updating to show proper risk. Many of the counties that were updated that you see here were also just digital conversions of old paper maps as well. And so those guys need studying as well. If we look at the current availability of DFIRM data, there are still 26 counties within Colorado that do not have digital data and are still using paper maps. And a few of these counties are still unmapped as well. As was mentioned, about half of these counties are receiving new digital data as part of the CHAMP program, and a remainder have a plan to initiate in the next 5 years. If we overlay the CNMS line work of map streams across the state, we can see that although the state has made progress digitizing counties as part of the MapMod program and the early phases of RISMAP, most of the stream miles are still unverified and need to be validated. This is a result of a lot of digital conversions that were performed in these counties not being model backed, as well as having expiring miles that just need to be updated. One of the reasons a number of the counties did not have valid data is because up until recently, good QL2 or quality level 2 LiDAR data just wasn't available in Colorado. We can see that prior to 2013, only a small handful of the state had coverage. LiDAR was then collected in the areas of the 2013 floods, given the stream morphology changed so much. This was needed because now areas that were never in the floodplain are now in active conveyance areas. This LiDAR kicked off the CHAMP program within Colorado, and then as we can see and move through time, there has been a large quantity of LiDAR data that has been collected, and now almost the entire state is covered. If we overlay this now with the CNMS line work again, we can see that almost the entire state's unverified inventory is covered or will soon be covered by high quality LiDAR. As such, the potential for updating the inventory and improving upon InView within Colorado is becoming a possibility. As a result of all the new LiDAR, CWCB has been able to both improve upon the data that was developed as part of the CHAMP program, in addition to moving projects forward through the various risk map phases. Starting with phase 1, or base level engineering and discovery, we can see that although only a handful of counties have been completed to date, there are quite a few ongoing BLE projects that are actively being performed. For those counties that already had data development performed as part of CHAMP, in some cases the scopes are being expanded to increase the number of mapped miles in the county, or some streams are able to be fully modeled because previously the counties didn't have full LiDAR coverage. And in other cases, the models are being used to model back Zone A's that would be more appropriate to model in a 2D environment. In all instances, though, the data is being made available to local officials so that they can plan, regulate, and mitigate better within their communities. FEMA funding has also been requested as part of the FY20 grants to initiate several more BLE studies. Those are the ones in green or upcoming. Combined, these BLE studies are going to help Colorado validate thousands of miles of Zone A streams within the state. And it also will serve as a basis for the potential to upscale these to Zone AE studies as well. The state also has a number of ongoing studies. These are those projects that are currently undergoing data development, so hydrology, hydraulics, floodplain mapping, or have recently had flood risk review meetings or will have upcoming flood risk review meetings in the very near future. Finally, we have those in phases 3 and 4, which have gone preliminary or post-preliminary. There are just a small handful of these counties currently, but within the next year or two, there's going to be a huge number of these counties that go preliminary, and that's going to keep going as the state updates the miles and has ongoing projects year over year. This brings us to some of the enhancements the state of Colorado is bringing in addition to the traditional flood mapping. The state of Colorado has performed regional hydrology on 6 major large stream basins across the state. And the state is fortunate to have a great collection of gauge data that goes back many, many years. This might have something to do with water rights, but nonetheless, we have been able to leverage that data to create a bigger picture of the state's surface water hydrology. These studies included the Colorado River, which was very likely the first study in the nation to use Bulletin 17C methods at such a scale. We actually worked closely with the folks at USGS to help troubleshoot the SSP software as this study was being performed. It also included the flood-controlled Arkansas River, where we had to work closely with the DWR to understand how and when flood control structures were regulated, and how data from historic storms that would no longer occur due to flood control should be incorporated into the study. And the groundwater level-driven Rio Grande River, which included a groundbreaking study of the interaction between groundwater pumping, irrigation diversions, and surface water, and how over time these changing factors have significantly changed the flood potential of the river. Each of these basins benefited greatly from performing a regional study that that instead of looking at a single gauge, gave vastly different results looking at them from a watershed perspective. Paleo studies were also performed in each of these basins where appropriate so that we could better understand and improve upon the precision of the hydrology. With all the 2D BLE being performed across the state, the goal has been to develop Zone A ready 2D BLE models so that the vast majority of Zone A miles can be quickly and efficiently model backed and validated. With this comes some challenges, however, as there becomes a need for smaller models for community usability, refined stream regions to better define flow paths, the inclusion of roadways and other structures that impact flood flows, the need to model hydraulic structures that impact flood flows as well, and also enhancing the calibration performed so there is an assurance the results being produced are accurate. Using a number of tools and techniques that have been developed by Wood over the years, not just through our work in Colorado, but also in Kansas and Missouri, and also our investment in the necessary technology infrastructure, we are able to quickly and efficiently perform 2D BLE that produces accurate Zone A results. 2D BLE, though, could be an entire presentation in and of itself, so please feel free to reach out to me directly if you have any questions with our methods or processes that might be able to help you out. With all the 2D BLE being performed, we're also looking for ways to leverage the richness of the data and display results in such a way that it will help communities better identify their risk and target mitigation actions they can take. This includes flood depth grids such as this that show flooding over time so that emergency action can be taken during floods and mitigation efforts targeted. This also includes velocity grids that dynamically show the moving water. Given the national conversation around 2D floodways and how to develop them, how to map them, how to accurately show them, these products can, independent of that, help to inform floodplain administrators of risk and provide an additional tool for regulating floodways administratively, in addition to just those shown on the maps. Some of the other work that CWCB is doing is around identifying vulnerable structures and critical facilities that are at high risk of flooding. This is being done through a pilot project called the Flood Risk Information System, or FRIS. The FRIS will provide flood risk information through an online web mapping portal for both the public and emergency management personnel to understand and pinpoint risk before, during, and after floods. The pilot project is currently underway in Mesa County, Colorado, with the hope that it can be deployed elsewhere. Additionally, the data from the FRIS, along with the 2D BLE data that is being performed, will hopefully help to develop and enhance a real-time stream gauge mapping program within the state, where available stream data can be used to map existing flooding as well as project flooding expected during large storm events as they are occurring real-time. CWCB has also completed an erosion hazard zone study for a select number of communities across the state. This project involved the development and implementation of a program for mapping fluvial hazard erosion areas and developing technical standards that can be applied throughout Colorado communities. This again resulted from the 2013 flood event where we saw risk that extended well beyond the mapped flood areas due to severe erosion that the high flows had on stream banks. Ultimately, this project provided a new framework for regulatory guidance and included the development of multiple GIS-based tools and online platforms for fluvial hazard mapping. This data is now accessible for displaying and analyzing the fluvial hazard risks within communities, allowing community officials to review information at any time in high resolution. And on the note of 2D floodways, the state of Colorado has also been at the forefront of the national 2D floodway conversation. This started with a work group within the state of Colorado brought together to discuss the challenges of not only developing but regulating 2D models in floodways. Many of the ideas that are currently under consideration and being implemented around 2D models nationally have resulted from what was called the Colorado 2D Consortium, or C2DC. This group still meets and every other week discusses topics related to 2D modeling within the FEMA world. Currently, this involves creating best practices for rain on grid modeling within the state. The hope from this group is to be able to find common sense ways to regulate waterways modeled in 2D and ultimately find ways to leverage the power of 2D models to make web-based flood zone determinations, perform no-rise analyses, and delineate floodways, both meeting existing CFR or Code of Federal Regulations requirements and also engaging in the conversation around policy changes that may occur in the future. Colorado has also teamed with the Mile High Flood Control District to develop step-by-step instructions and guidance for performing letter of map amendments using LiDAR. There have been multiple successful projects performed, and as a result, the number of homes that were incorrectly mapped into a high-risk flood zone have been able to be removed without the need for survey of the properties. And finally, CWCB, in partnership with AECOM, has developed snowmelt and post-fire hydrology and hydraulics and has performed some test studies with this. This study looks at data from 2019, which was a high snowpack year in Colorado, and provided data for early warnings on the potential for snowmelt flooding. Isaac Allen with AECOM actually has a presentation on this as part of this year's virtual conference, so my encouragement to you is to go watch that presentation.
Colorado has come a long way from the MapMod years and still has a long way to go, but we are proud of the efforts that have been made to benefit the people of our state and really to make our communities safer and more resilient. We continue to seek ways to improve communication with the local officials and provide better messaging to help folks understand their flood risk and what that means to them. We understand that managing the flood program is not the main job or the only job for many local floodplain administrators. Each community is different, and we have developed resources and tools to help meet the needs of each community at their level, whether they have a full and complete understanding or they are brand new to the risk map program. The mapping process is complex, and in addition, it can be a lengthy process with many quality control and quality checkpoints and due process requirements to ensure that we have the highest quality flood studies and mapping products that local communities can use and depend on and fully support. Sometimes changes to the project scope can take place that extend the project timelines, and during this process, we have encountered staff turnover in many local communities. We've been able to develop some ways to help minimize disruption and help local officials stay in the loop through early engagement and set better expectations so that local community officials know they are vested in this process. And they also have a role to play in the success of the projects. Some of our strategies are listed here, and we have found that thus far local community participation rates have increased, and we have been able to obtain some useful information very early on in a project with a questionnaire at the discovery point that can provide us with more specific needs for each community. We have an amazing state website, the coloradohazardmapping.com website. Please check it out when you have a chance, which was developed after the 2013 flood and has now evolved into a broader website and resource for the Risk Map program. We have developed story maps for each county and are able to provide data such as survey points, depth grids, and changes since last firm for each project that is going through a risk map project in our state. This is an example of Boulder County, and you can see on the top tab all the different components of that project and the data that is available to anyone in the public. We've also developed a homeowner report that can be generated and provides current and proposed flood risk at a specific location, and it also provides some basic stats for that location. This has come in handy at all of our public meetings. We are also working on some additional templates that local communities can utilize and tailor to do their own outreach, and we are starting a new risk map video series which will cover the different components of mapping and the map update process to help answer the frequently asked questions that we hear time after time. Now that the CWCB will be taking on the LOMR review partnership with FEMA, we also hope to develop our own in-state hydraulic model repository in the next few years. These efforts have been very timely with what's going on with social distancing and everything going virtual. These online tools and resources are available, and we will continue to add to our site as we gather feedback from local communities and obtain their specific needs. Thank you for your time, and that ends our presentation, and we'll open it up for any questions you might have.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Thuy. That was a very interesting presentation. I know that I was taking notes because I see things that I would like to incorporate at Arkansas. We do have a few questions. The first question, who is paying for the LiDAR field work?
I'll take that question. So a lot of the LiDAR collection was paid through the 3DEP program, and some of it was state funded, so it just kind of depends on the location. So each acquisition was different, but mainly it was USGS, FEMA funded, some of the local communities contributed as well, and then there were some state funds that also were contributed to the acquisitions, either from our agency or from the Division of Reclamation and Mining or from the Colorado Geological Survey.
And Thuy, a follow-up question, is this data available if someone wanted it? Should they contact you, or is there one location or repository for this information?
Yes, you can go to the coloradohazardmapping.com website. So if you want to look at the data or download the data that's available, you can go there. The LiDAR is also available for the public as well. So.
We have a question about the Colorado 2D Consortium. Is there any published information documenting the best practices that have been developed and the FEMA coordination that was mentioned?
I can take that one. we about 6 months ago, there was a kind of a white paper that we put together that kind of brought everybody's ideas together, and that was primarily around floodways and how to do 2D floodways. And that was then presented to the national, they call it the 2D floodway IPT, and that group is kind of meeting every month or 2 months as they kind of create more national, looking at changing standard IDs and whatnot, which they're hoping to push into a November guidance update. So that was the only official paper that was developed as part of the Colorado, and currently we're discussing 2D rain on grid. That will be published once those meetings are over here. I think in July is probably when we're going to wrap that up and then kind of compile everybody's thoughts together into a paper.
Following up on that, is there opportunity for other stakeholders to participate both within Colorado and outside of Colorado? Is this an open work group, or are there public meetings online at this point?
Yeah, so for the Colorado one, yeah, I mean, if anyone's interested, I mean, we're always looking for ideas and people. I mean, this is very Colorado specific and looking for creating guidance and standards for Colorado itself. But if people have some good ideas that they want to share, definitely we'd be open to hearing what others have to say and how they might be able to apply it in their states. Nationally, we're not the coordinators of that, so it would be hard to. But I mean, I'm sure we can get them on a list for that as well. I can point them in the right direction at least.
All right. And Thuy, following up on that incredible website, the Colorado Hazard Mapping and Risk Map portal, how long has it been up? And is there a model? Do you feel that this is a good model for other states involved in the CTP program?
Well, I think it's a great model that others could use. It was developed right after the flood event. The program started in 2015, so that's when it was developed, and it's kind of evolved over time, and it's still in the works of being updated now. Just because the program is over, and we still have some information from CHAMP that we're converting over to Risk Map, but I think it's really improved, and we've gotten a lot of good feedback from people who visited the website. So if anyone's interested, they can contact me and give them some more information about the development of the website.
All right, that's good. So, Thuy, I'm going to ask you another question. Do you feel that this, are you seeing the investment that you would like by the local communities in the use of this data? And I noticed that you had outreach opportunities and trying to get the information out there. What do you feel are the most successful techniques you have for building that
well, it's
commitment?
I'm sorry. So it's been a learning process, from the beginning. I've been with the program for so many years, and you think you've got something figured out, but then things always change. And I think what we've realized is, you can't have enough outreach and communication. Like I said, there's always turnover. There's always people who thought you think they heard it, but they didn't. And so we just try to provide as many different ways to present the data to them as possible, and just continue to repeat it and make sure that they're on board through the process at each checkpoint. So we've really developed a lot of good templates along the way for different, the different milestones each meeting, and getting more feedback from the community officials as well. I think that's important. Documentation is a really big thing for us as well. So I think it's been more successful. We're kind of making these changes. So I don't really have an end story yet, but I've gotten a lot of good feedback from communities that they're appreciative of the resources we have available, and it's always there on the website. Every single meeting, we document everything, and we post it on the website under their community, so it's there for them for their use. So.
All right, and one more question for Chris. Chris, with the 2D, I noticed you mentioned using it to develop floodways. Do you think that this is the wave of the future, to use the 2D modeling for floodways as opposed to the traditional one-dimensional way of doing it?
Yeah, I think it really depends. I mean, for certain areas, 2D is really powerful and should be, in my mind, used for floodways, because it's going to provide a more accurate representation of the risk. That being said, right now, the way that the Code of Federal Regulations is and how floodways are regulated, it does make it a lot more difficult to develop those floodways, and we have to go through a whole bunch of hoops. So really, I mean, we're still producing 1D floodways where possible because of that. But I think, in the future, once the regulations are changed and we start to look at floodways differently, then I do think at that point 2D is probably the way to go in a vast majority of the country. In some cases, though, 1D still is going to produce just results that are just as accurate.
Thank you. I encourage everyone who is participating today that if you have additional questions, you may think of things after the session is over, please reach out to Chris, please reach out to Thuy with your questions. I'm sure that they will be happy to provide more information and have a discussion with you about how their practices could be used in your communities. Thank you.
Thank
for your presentation. It was very informative. And like I said, I'll be using some of it in Arkansas. So we're going into the final portion of our discussion. And we're going to go into the great state of Kansas to talk about two-dimensional base level engineering and statewide initiative. The presenter for that portion of the presentation is Tara Lanzrath, She's the floodplain mapping coordinator in the Kansas Department of Agriculture. She'll be joined by Joanna Rolfe, who's with the Kansas Department of Agriculture. Thank you, and remember to put your questions in the Q&A, and we'll address them after the session.
My name is Tara Lanzrath, and I'm the Floodplain Mapping Coordinator with the Kansas Department of Agriculture. I'm happy to be here today to talk about our 2D base level engineering initiative. With me today, I have Joanna Rolfe.
Hi everyone, I'm Joanna Rolfe. I'm a floodplain mapping specialist with the state of Kansas. I work with Tara, and I'm recording this here from my oceanfront property in Kansas.
All right, thanks Joanna. So as I mentioned, we're here today to talk about what we're doing in Kansas as far as our 2D base level engineering initiative. So this is session A1. So to start today, we wanted to first welcome you to Kansas, and then we'll talk about what 2D base level engineering is. And then we'll talk about how we've modified our risk map process, some of the bumps along the road that we've had as we've gone through this initiative, the BLE guidance we're working on, and then some of our 2D BLE deliverables. So some fun facts about Kansas. In Kansas, farmland covers more than 88% of the total land, and we have 27 walnut creeks in the state. One thing I wanted to point out is that despite popular belief, Kansas is actually not the flattest state, and it isn't even in the top 5 of the flattest states. As you can see on the left here, Kansas is home to the Flint Hills, which is this region here. And if you're ever in Kansas, I would encourage you to visit these because they are quite pretty. Some precipitation trends in Kansas. So in the western parts of the state, it is fairly dry with annual precipitation, in many areas being less than 20 inches per year. As you move towards the eastern parts of the state, you get an increase of precipitation, especially in the southeastern portions that can get up to close to 50 inches of rain. The population in Kansas, the total population is 2.9 million as of 2018. And you can see in this map here, some of our higher population cities, such as Kansas City, Wichita, and some of these other areas as shown on this map. And so in general, our regulatory floodplain maps follow those precipitation and population trends. So here's a map of our regulatory flood insurance rate map locations. So as I mentioned, in the eastern parts of the state where we have more precipitation, we have more flood insurance rate maps. Anything in the light blue areas have effective digital flood insurance rate maps. The darker blue has had effective DFIRMs with some redevelopment. Anything in the green color was still paper-based, but is going through the process of updating those maps to new digital maps. Anything in white does not have a countywide map, but as you can see, especially as we move out west, some of these communities just have paper-based maps that are older and don't exist countywide. Gray has those older paper-based county-wide maps. And so what we're trying to do is use base level engineering in our process to update our floodplain maps across the state. And so that's really our vision, is finding a cost-effective way to bring floodplain maps to areas that have not had them before, and just to update our floodplain map inventory. So what is 2D modeling? So starting with HEC-RAS 5.0, it now includes a robust 2D engine and is no longer limited to 1D modeling. 2D models allow for water movement in multiple directions. So it's going to look at your entire area rather than a linear step-by-step computation. The modeling uses a mesh rather than individual cross-sections and calculates water movement everywhere, not just along specific streams identified with cross-sections. So as you can see here with the mesh, each one of these cells is basically like a mini cross-section. And it uses break lines to realign and resize mesh cells along features such as roadways and stream banks, such as here. This just shows a comparison of the 1D modeling and 2D modeling. So on the right here is your traditional 1D model with cross sections that has more of a one-directional flow of the water movement. Over here is actually a hybrid between a 1D and a 2D model area. Right now we are still doing our detailed studies with floodways as 1D, but we're doing our zone A's as 2D models, starting with our base level engineering. Another thing we've done in Kansas is we have created custom watersheds. And so you can see here the red outlines are our Huck 8 watersheds, and we've basically combined these to make an overall what we're calling our custom watershed. And so the reason for this is because we wanted to prevent counties from having to go through multiple projects, because some counties are divided into many different watersheds. And so it just simplifies our process, and it makes it so that we only have to do outreach one time instead of many times for a project. So base level engineering, again, we're doing this on our large custom watershed scale. We are basing this on high resolution LiDAR. We do have that statewide data set available. And we are using 2D modeling in Kansas for this approach. Base level engineering produces Zone A ready floodplains, and these Zone A communities can begin to use this data as best available data prior to the maps becoming effective and prior to the new regulatory flood insurance rate maps. And so here's an example. One thing to note with our base level engineering, we do have this larger custom watershed, but we are breaking out the models into different sub-watersheds. And so that's going to be important, as Joanna will describe later, as far as avoiding having duplicate, or not duplicate, but having two models in one community, trying to avoid that overlap. So we've done our base level engineering in different project phases. So the first phase here was for FY18. We covered all these areas in blue. In FY19, we have 2D BLE projects filling in for these darker blue areas. And then with our proposed FY20 grant, we are filling in these other remaining areas out west. And so, this is pretty much a statewide 2D base level engineering data set. These remaining areas shown in white here were previous 2D modeling projects that were implemented prior to the BLE process that we're doing, but we still have updated data for these areas. Here's a comparison of 1D and 2D models in Glasgow, Kansas. So on the left, we have the traditional 1D modeling that is LiDAR based. On the right, we have the LiDAR based 2D modeling. And so just to illustrate here with the 2D models, you can see more of a multi-directional flow of water here that can extend out into the streets. But still overall, roughly the same type of floodplain, but just being able to get more of that multi-directional flow with that 2D modeling. Another thing that we are doing with our LiDAR is hydro enforcement. So what hydro enforcement is basically allowing the terrain to continue to show the downward flow of water. So essentially here in this top image, you see this road fill here, and then in the bottom image, you're showing where they've burned in that culvert essentially, so that it can allow the water to continue to move downhill, which is important, of course, for floodplain mapping. We will hopefully have a statewide hydro-enforced LiDAR data set to use as the basis for our base level engineering projects. We've had some delays with the delivery of our newer LiDAR data set, but we're hoping to get that data soon and be able to move forward with that project. We also are looking to update our streamlines from that to update our CNMS database to have a good topographically correct stream data set within that database. And the funding for the hydro enforcement has come from the NRCS, and we've also gotten some funding through our FEMA CTP grant for that. So we have modified our risk map process some with this. So here's a traditional, or more of a traditional risk map project timeline. The one thing I will note is that we do hold our public open houses before the maps become preliminary. So that's One of the ways we had already modified this process, but the main thing we're here to talk about today is how we've added this 2D base level engineering into our process as the first step before discovery. And so what that does is that allows for that initial floodplain review to happen at the discovery and kickoff phase. So instead of going into discovery and needing to find out more information about that watershed, we're already going in with that those initial draft floodplains, and so we're beginning that review process much earlier. And so, you know, usually you'd have to wait almost a year for data development to produce that data, and now we're getting that sooner for communities to start reviewing. Another thing we're doing is, instead of having this resilience focus at the end of a project, we're moving this back up and putting this at the discovery phase of the process. So again, you know, what does this mean for discovery? So now that we've already done some of the initial floodplain maps, we're now using the discovery phase to focus more on technical assistance. We have created a technical assistance webpage, and we are showing some of these examples of the technical assistance projects we have during discovery to try to get more interest in having these technical assistance projects. We still will use discovery to gather any additional information, such as high water marks or updated imagery or survey information, but really we're starting to focus on this technical assistance at this BLE and discovery phase. So the funding for technical assistance has been made available since FY18 from our CTP grant. Basically, we can have predefined projects, but we also just have, you know, this budget or money we can budget as we determine what projects are identified in a watershed. We are hoping to increase our coordination with the Kansas Department of Emergency Management and Hazard Mitigation Planning. We have a current project in Hutchinson, Kansas, that will fund an educational brochure, and this brochure will have statewide applicability. And so basically we're trying to identify funding sources through KDEM or Kansas Department of Health and Environment, because, you know, our technical assistance funds can be used to model different scenarios, but they can't actually, you know, fund improvement projects themselves. And so that's why we're hoping to help also identify those for communities. Our goal is to create on the ground mitigation actions early in the risk map process, so that before the maps become effective, they can actually see some reductions in the special flood hazard area. So with that, I've given you an overview of how we've initiated base level engineering across the state. And of course, not everything goes smoothly. And so Joanna is going to talk to us about some of the bumps in the road we've experienced along the way.
Yeah, thanks, Tara. Yeah, so doing this process, we have 3 engineering consulting firms that we utilize, and we discovered fairly early on that there are some different techniques that each were using different from each other. And so we've had discussions regularly throughout the process to kind of hash out those differences and see if they make a difference in the results, and if we need to have a standard or if we can continue using those different processes. One example is with hydrology, and through technical review, because we have our consultants review each other's work, through the review and discussion, it was found that certain methods underestimated flows in smaller drainage areas. So we decided to use the NRCS nested distribution instead of NOAA Atlas 14 temporal distribution, as it just works better in the 2D model over a wide area, like we're modeling at the moment. Okay, so for BLE floodplain plotting, the models are really good at capturing all the area, the flood hazard information for all the area of the 2D model. But when it comes to creating that floodplain that fits on a regulatory map, or what we think of as the 1% annual chance floodplain or special flood hazard area, there were some challenges that we've had to address. A lot of times along the edges, it will create this little like bowl effect, and so the elevations rapidly increased along the edges of the floodplain. So we had to address ways to make it a more reasonable BFE across the whole floodplain, because we didn't want these BFEs just contouring along the edges. And so if you're going through this process, creating contours, 1 foot contours or BFEs for the floodplains as they're plotted is a really good tool in checking to make sure they're plotting correctly. We have 2 different approaches that our contractors are using. One is the shorelining, where it takes values in the middle and projects them out to the edges. So it's no longer quite matching the model at that location, but it's more reasonable of a BFE. And then another option is this floodplain plotting, where using the max water surface elevation points from the 2D RAS cells as centroids, and really densifying the points so that you get that accurate BFE along the edge and carries on through out the floodplain. And so both seem to work and create similar results. So this is an area where we decided we didn't need to have a standard and force one way of doing it, but we could use both options. Another thing to keep in mind if you're doing this type of work is that since the floodplain, the flood information extends well into the upper reaches of the watershed, you may run into plotting well above what you would want for your regulatory floodplains. So just keep in mind that you need that 1 square mile stream extent to have a good file to check against, because you may end up with a lot of extra floodplain going well beyond what you need to map and what would be expected to be mapped. All these red areas, this is an example of a county that had recently been remapped using 1D methods on LiDAR, and then when we did the BLE, it showed a lot of extensions that didn't seem reasonable, and came to find out that it just got plotted too far. And so this is something to keep in mind for the ITR reviews, and something to check against. Another thing that we discovered is watershed boundary issues. So Tara kind of touched on this, but those 2D models have a little bit of overlap. They need to be able to capture the correct drainage, and they do oftentimes connect to each other. But we were initially just doing it based off of watershed boundaries, but an important thing to consider is where there's population, because in areas of populations, you really don't want a conflicting data source giving a different BFE. So you need to have that model be the authoritative model and avoid overlapping communities to prevent any kind of discrepancies. Another challenge that we're confronting at the moment, because we've moved into the western part of our state, which has been largely unmapped and has a lot of hydrology challenges. Part of the challenges are due to the groundwater depletion through irrigation. So the aquifers, like the Ogallala aquifer, are being depleted, and that's affecting how much water is being absorbed by the soil when it rains, and really bringing down the flows of our streams out there, our rivers that have gauges. So through research, we discovered that the USGS regression equations use only post-1978 gauges for their calculations in the western part of the state. And as you can see, this is a gauge on the Arkansas River in Syracuse, Kansas, that you can see that the flows since 1978, the 1970s, have really been hovering close to zero when they were up and all over, and much more different frequencies previous to that. the building of dams also affects that, so we're taking that into consideration. And as we're creating this guidance on what to do here, using post 78 seems reasonable because it reflects current conditions, but we're also trying to be cognizant of whether or not that is going to underrepresent the flashy tributary flooding that can occur off those main branches, and also try to do our best at understanding if a big historic flood event happened, like what happened in 1965, for example, in this area, would it happen the same way, or would it happen drastically different? And so these are a lot of unknowns around this, but we've had conversations with hydrology experts in the area and brought all our consultants to the table and trying to hash that out and figure out the best way forward for that. And that brings me to the BLE guidance that we're working on, but it's constantly under construction because there's always something that we need to address. And our discussions that we have with our contractors and others that have invested interests are guiding this. We're trying to create a document that will outline the acceptable approaches to 2D BLE modeling so that we have a consistent, highly accurate floodplain data set throughout the state. We're covering model setup, hydrology, floodplain mapping, and plotting as main topics for this guidance. And as kind of discussed throughout, but some of that will be guidance that we expect to be followed, and some of it will be outlining the different approaches and why they're acceptable. So that's just something we're working on right now. We need to have further discussion on how we update models throughout the process, because our process has always been geared towards public comments, getting a lot of input early on and making updates as needed. So how do we update these watersheds that are really, these models that are really holistic, that take the whole area into account? And then, as Tara mentioned, we're doing 1D models for floodway areas, but as new guidance comes out, or is there a path forward for using these 2D floodways potentially? So that's just something we'll be discussing further as we go. The deliverables for the 2D model include the water surface elevation grids, depth grids, velocity grids, and then there's also animations that can be extracted, which are powerful outreach tools. And I'll show an example here. So, okay, as you can see, this is an area that we did a BLE for, and you can see how the water, the flooding comes on and then it goes away. So this can, when we've shown this to communities, they've been really excited about this option because it shows it's a useful tool for emergency responders and just understanding what's happening when it's flooding. Okay. And then another thing is that for our BFE portal, the grids that were part of the deliverables are used for this BFE portal. We have users sign up and they can request a base flood elevation for an area, and eventually, and in some places we have it available to where the grid provides the elevation automatically, and we just approve the results. But at the moment, we still, where there's areas of development, it's not in this portal yet, but it will be used to inform the portal. Okay, so I think that's about it. I don't know if you have anything else that you'd like to say, Tara, but our contact information is here. So if you want to get in touch with us, please feel free to do so.
Thanks, Joanna. We hope you've enjoyed a look inside our 2D BLE initiative in Kansas. As you can see, there are many challenges we're currently working through with this approach, such as the hydrology differences between the drier western regions of the state and the wetter eastern regions of the state. But we are confident in our ability to resolve these. We have really found that BLE is a great way to efficiently update our floodplains and bring that flood risk information to areas that haven't had it before, all while further increasing our emphasis on community and public review. That's really important to us as far as the steps in our process. The data development phase is the next phase after BLE, and that's where we will further enhance the floodplains with the detailed study areas and include those 1D floodways that are often 2D informed. We're also going to, continue to stress technical assistance during that discovery phase, and we're really excited to hopefully see some possible on-the-ground mitigation actions that we can incorporate into our mapping projects. So again, we're really happy to be here today to share our initiative with you, and with that, we're willing to take any questions you have.
Another great session on BLE data and how it can be of help gaining a greater understanding of flood risk to properties and people and what we can do to mitigate and manage it. So we do have a lot of questions in our Q&A box, and we're running short on time. So I'm going to take about 3 of them, and any additional questions you have, please feel free to contact the presenters to get those questions answered. The first question, who can access this BLE data?
Good question. So originally when we do the BLE data, we make it only accessible to community officials. Since it's still so early in development and it will change with enhancements in data development, we don't want that to get out to the public too soon. The exception would be if someone needed a base flood elevation, they could make that request through our base flood elevation portal and get that as best available data sooner. Mm-hmm. But we wouldn't then present the base level engineering data to the public until after it's been through data development.
So have you run into situations where the BLE data shows a very different result from the current approximate AMAP? And if so, how is that handled? Is it handled as best available data?
So we do monitor, the requests that come in for base flood elevations. And so if there's an existing structure, we'll often still go ahead and issue that base flood elevation that could be used for perhaps a letter of map change. But certainly if the new data is, or the existing data is more restrictive, then we do encourage that to be used since it is still an early data set. Right. So if that makes sense.
Yes. So getting more into the weeds, if you will, the engineering weeds, when we're looking at smaller streams versus larger streams, are they assessed separately or distinctly? Is there some way of accounting for the difference in the watershed size?
So it's all part of one model. Mm-hmm. So they are assessed at the same time, but there are a couple methods for the aerial reduction that our engineers use, and we could follow up with more details, but essentially the 2 methods would be providing like a aerial reduction across the whole watershed that brings down some flows and make sure that it matches at gauges. And then another is where they're cutting off the tails of the hydrograph. So we're keeping those peaks in the middle so that we're capturing the flashier floods for the smaller tributaries.
All right, we're going to take one more question. What type of hydrology is used for the 2D BLE?
I'm not sure, Tara, if you want to answer this or but I can take a stab.
Sure.
So it's rainfall, excess rainfall on grid hydrology, and then we'll use other sources like the gauge data, regression equations to validate and try to match it as best as possible in
Yes.
areas where that's available.
And again, as we mentioned in the presentation, you know, there are differences in the eastern and western portions of the state. And so we're still evaluating how we may do this out west. And we are putting together that BLE guidance. And so if someone wanted more information on how we're doing this, we could certainly provide that. Just keep in mind it's still draft and it's still kind of being developed, but we're happy to share that. And we can also check with our engineers and ask any more specific questions as well. So.
Okay, I know there's a lot more questions in the Q&A. Unfortunately, we're already going over time, so I'm going to have to close the session in a moment. I encourage you to contact the presenters, not only those from Kansas, but also those from Texas and Colorado, if you have additional questions. I know that there were some questions about accessing the slides. ASFPM will be posting recordings of all of the sessions at a later date that you can access. But if you want specific slides, please feel free to contact the presenters for that information. So once again, I want to thank everyone from Texas, from Colorado, from Kansas. Thank you. I learned a lot, and I know all of us did. Great questions came through. I hope this inspires us to go and create BLE data for all of those watersheds that are unmapped, could use updated flood risk information. I'd like to remind everyone that we're about to go into the plenary session at 11 a.m. So I hope to see you there, and thank you all for joining us today.